I might end up splicing that in anyways, but as an intro, there's an intro music that would come in right here. And welcome to the Fortify Your Data podcast. I'm Michael Hudak. I'm here with the Impelix CTO Thomas Whang. Just want to start off, one, thank you for coming on. I appreciate your time. If you want to just give me a brief overview of who you are, what you do, and what Impelix is working on, and then we'll roll from there.
Absolutely. So thanks for having me, Michael. It's great to be here. My name is Thomas Whang, and I am the CTO of Impelix and one of our founders. So I'll start with who we are, and then work my way down to how I got into all this. So for us as Impelix, who we are is the fact that we're a premier next generation cybersecurity integrator, providing what we call partner as a platform. And what that means is a set of services that we act as our client's advisor, integrator, and managed service provider, right? And our whole purpose in this is to allow organizations to be very good and get towards a more mature cybersecurity model, right? So how do we do that? We do it in 3 different ways: providing the advisor services, and that's where we help companies integrate their business strategy, right, and their cybersecurity strategy. And what that will do is it gives them the ability to incorporate cybersecurity at the speed of business, right? So that helps in their ability to keep up with the speed of the business. Secondly, as a reseller, right, this company was developed as a service organizations first. So we actually really pride ourselves in our ability to execute on our engineered solutions. So we partner with the leaders of many of these cybersecurity domains to bring our customers the best cybersecurity solutions out there, along with our services tied into it, and deliver the solution that supports their strategic cybersecurity initiatives. And lastly, managed services is our third line of service, and that boils down to the fact that many of organizations today do not necessarily have all the skill set or even the resources to be able to handle the cybersecurity stuff. So in this idea is keep your employees focused on the core task at hand, which is doing all their projects and doing all their productive things to keep the business moving in the direction in their fight for pivoting into their digital transformation strategy. What managed services allows you to do is offload the day-to-day, keeping the lights on type of task to the outsource, and then let your employees focus on the best thing that they do at hand, which is all the strategic and the projects that they should be focusing on.
Sure. So another way to put it is you guys are kind of keeping the lights on from a security perspective while your customers are innovating, right? Because you want them to be working on the things that they're best at, not necessarily all the what some might find mundane tasks of cybersecurity. So
correct.
Was that your call to action originally? I'm always interested in hearing, because you're the founder. A lot of times when these cybersecurity startups happen, sometimes they start up from an idea that was actually kind of separate from what the company ended up maturing into. What was the story of how you guys formed?
So we formed because we knew there was a need for cybersecurity services. I've been on the vendor side before, or reseller side before, and also as the customer side, right? So I've been on both sides, and this company was formed over 11 years ago. And at that time, we recognized a lot of the integrators out there just did product sales, and they were very bad at actually executing on delivering the solution with the technology. So, I after being on the customer side for so long and seeing all the poor execution of that, I realized once I became an SME on the cybersecurity world, especially in the perimeter security space, long before there was actually the real true concept of cloud in any way, shape, or form, right? The company was built on the fact that let's focus specifically on executing the delivery of services well, and that's how we started this company.
That makes a lot of sense. And I definitely agree with you, but I'm curious, what specifically are some examples of failing to deliver a cybersecurity product effectively?
So back in the day, I'll use the checkpoint technology. I've been working with checkpoint for 23 years. Yeah, and the biggest issue with delivering cybersecurity, especially like checkpoint, is the complexity, right? It can be very complex. You have to know both the security aspect of it, but also the networking aspect of it, the application aspect of it. And so you have to have that level of knowledge to be able to provide the proper security configuration that is as much of a holistic solution, right, from a technology point of view. Well, in those days, right, there was very few, I'd say, integrators or people that had the skills to be able to say, in a checkpoint firewall, you need to create all of these, specific configurations for your web applications. You need to have proper LAN segmentation. You need to have proper firewall rule identified based on, back in the day, there was no user identification. It was based on IP. So you need to know, how the IP scheme and structure was laid out. So all that had to come together and be done properly. Otherwise, there always ends up being gaps, and gaps equals risk.
Absolutely. And so as we in 2021 are looking at a very different cybersecurity landscape than we were, let's say, 10 years ago, do you
Yes.
find that those gaps are larger now or just different?
I would say both. And my reason for that is because the cybersecurity industry has grown tremendously, right? If you're familiar with Momentum Cyberscape's diagram, right now, the latest number is there's over 3,500 vendors in the cybersecurity space. So the sheer number of vendors out there is daunting and overwhelming to anybody in the corporate world, right? Add on top of that, in a typical organization, enterprise organization, you're going to see anywhere between 75 to 200 different products trying to do its own areas of cybersecurity support. So you put all that together, how is anyone supposed to really get a full holistic view of what's happening in their environment? So the more products and vendors you have in the cybersecurity world, the complexity goes up. And what I tell all of our clients is, if complexity goes up, then gaps are absolutely going to exist. And the more gaps that are found or existing, then the higher the risk that comes into play. And so that is the reason why, one of the things our approach is trying to simplify cybersecurity. It reduce the number of tools, find the overlap, find what specifically that you need, so that we can prune the technologies out there, so that you get the data that you want and you have the visibility that you want and you need, so that now you have the ability to take the proper response when necessary.
Absolutely. And I think that, you touch on a very important thing, because a lot of people think that more vendors add complexity in terms of, oh, now you have to do application maintenance and patching. But I think it's also a user experience issue, right? And so when you guys are focusing on consolidating, how much of a factor is that user experience in terms of either merging applications, or I guess, how do you go about doing that? Can you walk me through that process a little bit?
Absolutely. So part of the process, as part of our advisory services, is what we'll do is we'll do a tool inventory and get a sense of what are all the tools that you're using today. And through that process, we map out the overlaps, right, and see where you do have the what percentage of overlap across the different tools do you have. So that's our first way of identifying where you can get better control over the visibility that you need to have without having to have more tools at it. Then the second aspect of that is how many of those tools can be integrated in some way, shape, or form. So typically API, right, integration is the first thing that we'll be looking at. Is what are all these tools? Are they legacy tools, or are they current tools that we can use to integrate as much of that data as possible. Then you start to say, as you aggregate that data, now how do you present it in a manner that's meaningful? In many ways, this will be some version of a SIM where all that data is aggregated into a SIM environment, and then you visualize that data in a manner that makes sense to the organization. And every organization is going to be different, so the information being displayed is different, but the formula and the process of getting that information to the customer is the same.
That makes a lot of sense. And so when you're out there, prospecting, looking at companies, what are the niches that you're finding have more value or get more value out of your service? For example, like retail needs a lot of cybersecurity, but they still typically, in my experience, don't have as many different moving parts as a software company, right?
Yeah.
So which industries do you find that you cater to the most, and I guess which are the most challenging for you?
I think it goes. We actually touch in many different industries, from manufacturing to pharmaceuticals, and then to financial services. So the industries are diverse, but I'll call it the need to be secure is the same, right? Everybody needs to have the ability to say, I need a baseline of security, and then you build the foundation up from there. That's where we'll come in and say, here's how, for an enterprise in the financial services, you have to look at both the internal aspects of it, the auditing aspect of it, and also regulatory. What compliance do you need to adhere to, right? And so provide all the cybersecurity tools to support those initiatives. For example, and then in the manufacturing industry, they may not necessarily have direct regulatory compliance, but whoever they supply their services to may be in an industry that has to be supported, and so they may have this downstream effect of having to adhere to many of those standards. So we have to investigate with them to understand what are your customers requiring from you, and then find that out as the least common denominator and build the cybersecurity platform from there. So those are just a couple of examples of how, as we gather information, we can build the strategy.
So how involved are you guys in creating that? Are you actually writing software, or do you have like some sort of customizable interface that kind of consolidates, or how do you deliver that, just so I can visualize that a little better?
Absolutely. So right now we are working internally on developing a solution to be able to do that. So we're creating our own product, and then at the same time we're using some of the commercial off-the-shelf products out there, right, to be able to aggregate that data and present it. Because the real effort here is on the visualization side, gathering the data and then creating a data model that allows you to be able to stitch all the events together in a cybersecurity world, right? It is a common practice, right? Splunk does it, Google Chronicle, or all those guys have a common model where any data coming in, you fit it into this model. So now you have the ability to stitch all the events together and understand, sequence of events occurring, right? The hard part of that is fantastic. All that data is there. How do you present this data in a meaningful manner that says, oh, this is actionable. Here's what this means. Here's what kind of action that needs to be taken. And that's the hard part that all of the vendors are trying to really put an effort towards, including us. Right? We want to be able to take all this data and tell you, or our team, right? Here's exactly what needs to be done, and then whether it's automated or manual, there's a way to respond without really thinking about it. All the work and triaging has been done for you.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest struggles with cybersecurity in particular is getting everyone on board with the policies and following procedure. And you had kind of touched on manufacturing and their current lack of regulation, although CMMC regulations in the government contracts are changing that for a lot of United States manufacturers. But when you're looking at some of these companies specific to manufacturing and you're seeing IoT devices, what are you worried about the most? Because from my perspective, I'm worried most about the users than
Yeah,
the devices, right? But the devices
absolutely.
are also a problem.
Yes, and the biggest concern that's coming up, and it's going to become more and more of a topic of conversation in the space, is the intersection, or I'll call it the colliding of cyber and the physical world, the cyber world and the physical world, and how that impacts human lives. Right? Gartner posted a article back in 2020 about the fact that there's likely going to be some sort of regulation where CEOs will now have to be liable for an event where the act of cyber, event causing either harm or death to a human, right? The organization may be liable. So that aspect of things is becoming more and more prominent because of the fact that because of IoT, right? Everything has an IP address now. Anything that has an IP address means it is reachable from outside world in some way, shape, or form, right? So if not secured properly, then we're going to see more of this conversation about how does an event in the cybersecurity world, right, cause physical harm. And we've seen some examples already. They're not as prominent as we've in the news cycles, but in the very near future, I think we will start to see more of that coming through.
I agree. I was also just reading an article about a lot of the technology that's kind of going into IoT devices that read your biochemical waste and then tell you how sick you are. And I think that's going to be huge, right? A lot of people don't like talking about fecal matter, but that's coming. And that data, I think, is going to be some of the most valuable data for not only, healthcare workers, but advertisers. And I think, figuring out how to navigate that's going to be huge.
Absolutely. So anything we do nowadays, there's always some sort of digital breadcrumb that we're leaving behind.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's no way around that. Unless you're living off the grid, you're leaving a digital breadcrumb everywhere. From your computer browsers, your mobile phones, all of that. You're leaving steps behind. One of the things that I'm actually looking into some research is the concept of genetic testing, right? For example, ancestry.com or
Mm-hmm.
or 23andMe, right? Where you want to learn about yourself, about what your makeup is. Well, who actually owns that data? What are they using it for? And now, what can it be used for? Right. Along with the fact that I can get information about my genealogy and my history of me, right? But that now genetic data could be used, for example, can be used against the healthcare industry, right? To now, how do you do insurance? If the genetic markers could show that you're predisposition for something, could that be used, against me for my healthcare policies? Right? So there's a lot of implications on all this data, as to your point about the testing, through the fecal matter. That all that is data now somebody can aggregate and then potentially use advertising for, for any numerous number of purposes that you may not have no longer control over.
Well, and it's especially scary because I think that, Elon Musk had a quote like 2 or 3 years ago where he's like, it's not obvious to a lot of people where technology is at unless you're in technology, right? It's almost like you're
Yeah.
like in California or in just big cities, you're in these spires where you're aware of what technology can do. And then if you're not, he's like, you're basically on the ground. You have no concept. And I think that,
Yeah.
like this podcast is mostly going to be people that kind of get it, right? They get data because it's mostly tech guys. But the people that I really worry about, hearing about this are the consumers that are going to be using these products most likely within the next 5-10 years and not really understand the implications of what,
Yes.
where their data goes.
Absolutely. And even, those that are in the industry, we have some concept of it, right? But we don't know the full implication right? What that's going to be, 5-10 years from now.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Just
it's the
like,
same thing with Facebook, right? People knew
yeah,
what was going on with the algorithm, but they still succumbed to it, right? And they were
yes,
working on the algorithm.
yeah.
It's scary. It's a huge concern. So I guess how do we fix it, right? Obviously, there's no silver bullet to that, so that might be an unfair question. But how would you approach, outside of just making people aware of it? What are some obvious things we can do now to protect people's personal information?
I think there's a few ways that I can think of. One is with the government's support, we need to have regulations. Right now, a lot of the regulations is way far behind the technology. Right. So the laws are always playing catch up. And that in of itself creates, that gap between what happens today and when the regulations catch up. So during that gap is where, things can happen. And there's the no man's land of how do you enforce, regulate that of it. So I think the regulation side has to catch up as close to the speed of technology. I don't believe they'll be able to keep up, but as long as you try to minimize that gap as much as possible, is there. The other thing would be is in the realm of data ownership, right? I think we're going to have to see a fundamental change in the way data is being stored right now. Right, if we think of it from everything in the world, data is somewhere centralized in either an organization or platform or somewhere, right? And now, whether you know it or not, you've given up that ownership of that data, and you've given the organization the custodian to maintain your data. Without knowing, there's so much opaqueness between that you don't really know how they're doing it, right? You only know about it when, because of the regulation that has been added, they have to disclose, right? But up until then, you have no clue what effort that they're actually putting in, if they're putting any effort, right, into that. So, in my perspective, the concept of data custodian and data ownership has to be, flipped and say that ownership has to stay with the owner, right? That's got it, and then giving the organizations and the platforms and whatever services you getting from, have to request, right, permission to access your data. So if you think down the line with that concept, right, this is where truly potentially where blockchain can help in being able to provide that level of ownership. And so you see some R&D projects being done today, right? Sir Tim Berners-Lee, right? The ultimate, the person who effectively created the World Wide Web, right? Mm-hmm. He has his company called Solid. He's working on the Solid project, where that's one of the goals is get rid of the centralized concept and have it decentralized and have the owners, be owning, whether it's identity, whether it's private data, whatever it is, keep the data ownership to the person and not having to give that custodian up.
Do you think that's a possible model with the way our just government is currently set up?
It is going against the grain, right? Yeah. I think from a technology perspective, I see that happening. How that impacts the government, we'll have to wait and see. It's just like the what's going on today with cryptocurrency, right? Mm-hmm. And the government, and how there's friction there, because you've got power to people of decentralization versus, right, the central Fed Reserve, right, that controls the money. So there's always that contention there. I think what we're going to see is something very similar. If I had to put my my genie hat on and think forward, I think one of the things you will see is the concept of identity, right? And seeing how identity can be used in the blockchain form to mitigate all the issues we have with phishing attacks, right? Credential theft, credential loss, and that creating the downstream effect of ultimately a security breach. Right?
Absolutely. But I think that, again, we kind of touched on earlier when we were talking before we technically started, but I think that it's such a challenge because the very nature of blockchain really is the exact opposite as the California regulation and GDPR. And I think that in a lot of ways they have it, like GDPR has a lot of things right, but the technology can't support it entirely.
And therein lies, right, the conundrum here is that to a certain degree, the regulations, tend to create them in a bubble without really understanding the true, capabilities and or the reality of what can be done. So yeah, it will be interesting how this all plays out.
Yeah, I'm very, very interested in that. I'm very, Bitcoin's such an interesting animal because it's so different than what I thought, blockchain was going to end up being. And I've struggled with like the use cases people come out with blockchain and Ethereum. I really think the best still to this day, the best use cases are Bitcoin and gambling, right? That's a trustless money exchange. Makes a lot of sense to me.
It makes total sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you start, attaching IDs to it, it gets tricky, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It's just it's so hard to actually implement that because at some point somebody has to have the data, right? And I guess it goes back to who do you trust to be that consortium for that data?
And yes, and therein lies the conundrum, as you put it, right? Is somebody's got to be the authoritative source, right? So whether it's an individual, an entity of some sort, right? And that's where I see, as long as there's transparency, and that's one of the things about blockchain is that, ideally it's transparent, right? And so therefore it will be authoritative across the board. But again, blockchain is not the silver bullet. It's not going to solve all problems, right? And as the concept of blockchain matures, as the technology matures, we'll start to see, how it could impact, both, regular technology world, but also, how it could impact the cybersecurity world.
Absolutely, yeah. So I did want to I want to shift gears a little bit because poking around your website, you've been a somewhat prolific writer, and you touched on something that I was talking about very recently outside of this in terms of going passwordless. If you could just give us a little refresher on what you mean by that and why you think we are headed towards a passwordless future.
It is actually very simple. If you look at all the breaches today, to this day, right, and you look at all the statistics, Verizon breach data report, they point out the fact that every year over 80% of breaches are sourced from compromised credentials, right? So that's the problem number one, is if we get rid of passwords, could it stop breaches? So one example of that is by enabling multi-factor authentication. As Microsoft and Google pointed out, that if you enable MFA, 90% of compromised credential theft is mitigated, right? So that is fantastic, but that still leaves you some points of error where MFA can't be compromised. So depending on the type of MFA, right, whether it's text messaging, right, whether it's a phone call, it could be bypassed, right? So then the next step is how do we shrink that vulnerability? And that's where passwordless comes in, right? Microsoft is currently at a rate of about 150 million users logins per month, right? And they themselves are pushing passwordless. We ourselves are saying the same thing, because if we get rid of passwords, we could prevent majority of the breaches. Our organization have been involved in many breaches, and they've all been in some way, shape, or form related to compromised credentials. So as a best practice and being able to get rid of all these problems, right? Let's go down the world of passwordless and get rid of that most prominent vector that the bad actors are using, right? So if you do get phished and it's asking for a username and password, you have no password to give.
Right. Right.
Right.
And to that note, something that I said on the last podcast, and I'll say it again, if your bank doesn't allow two-factor authentication, get a different bank.
Go ahead. Go to a different bank. Yep, absolutely.
I'm in Ohio, so it's not always it's not always as urban as I'd like it to be. And sometimes we have a lot of like banks and credit unions that are just like, well, people don't. It's too hard for people. I'm like, well,
I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah, you need to have. I'm a big fan of biometrics too. So I think that you should get a text code and then a fingerprint. I think that's pretty solid. Still, I guess theoretically, any lock made by man can be broken by man. But
yep,
it's tough because how do you get this generation of people that are so technologically resistant to obviously better security, right?
Yeah.
I feel like going back to like Coinbase, those Robinhood apps, anything that's using Plaid. I think Plaid's really done a great job getting that multi-authentication, making the fingerprints real easy to get to.
Yeah.
I think we're headed in the right direction, but there's a lot of these legacy, investment applications or banking applications that just need to pick it up, right?
Absolutely. So the advancement in the mobile technology is helping a lot in that sense, right? When you've got the facial recognition on the iPhones, right? When you've got the biometric fingerprints on all your phones now, the barrier to entry and the adoption rate, because it's so easy to set up, has been lowered, and so therefore more and more people will be utilizing it, and so that's one level of good that's coming out of the advancement in technology. The other thing in general, I think, is being able to communicate well, right? That cybersecurity is something that we all have to be mindful of, both from a business perspective and organizational perspective, but also from a personal perspective, right? Understand when you use a free product, right? You're giving up something, right, in return for that service. And people have to understand that when you do that, there's that end user license agreement specifically in there that says what they're doing with it, right? So we all have a tendency to scroll up, click accept without really thinking about what did I just sign up for, right, kind of thing. So I think there's a lot more user education as a society, right, to get people more well versed in the technology and really understanding what they are doing with their data and just in general, so that they're more security conscious. So think twice before signing up for these apps when it's free, right? Think twice before clicking on any link that you're getting, because it is a dangerous world out there on the internet.
Well, absolutely. And especially because some of the most well-known brands are really the ones that are exploiting those free services, right? And so I think that there's more visibility on it now than ever. I haven't seen a month go by where there's not some documentary popping up about Google or Facebook or 23andMe was another, very different implications for all of them, right? So Facebook's your personal information, Google is physically where you're at and what you're interested in, and 23andMe is your actual biology. And so it's coming at every angle. I really think the only answer is the government's going to have to put limits on what people are able to give away for free, because at the end of the day, I don't know, I mean, that's my personal opinion, but I think that people have a really hard time looking in to their own interests when it comes to something they don't particularly understand.
Yes, absolutely. And regulations, like I said, has to catch up.
Yeah.
All right. So that there's some level of control, so that the the companies do not make their own rules.
Absolutely. And we are fast coming up on where everyone's attention span drops off according to the analytics. So as I kind of walk you out, if there's anything that you want to plug or anything, if people want to learn more about Impelix, I'm going to have links to your website, your LinkedIn, any of that information. Is there anywhere else people should be going to learn more about what you are and what you're doing?
Absolutely. We on impelix.com/blog, we actually put content on there every month, right, on some of the things that we see as of things that we should be thinking about, right? Not just what's happening today, but really the forethought of what we should be looking down the road. For me, my job here is to inform, right, both organizations and people about here's what we're seeing in the industry or in the market, right? And we want to be able to help guide people and give them really some thoughts to think about. How can they use this information in their lives personally, but also how can this information also be used from a company and organizational perspective in the realm of cybersecurity? Because ultimately what we're wanting to do is make the internet secure, and we're doing that. We want to do our part.
It's a noble cause. I definitely root you on. I was very excited when the opportunity came up to interview you. I'll admit I hadn't heard about you guys prior, but when I looked at your website, I'm like, oh, this is all my stuff. This is my bread and butter. I think that, just even talking to you here, I think you have the right head on your shoulders for cybersecurity. I think you're kind of doing it for the right reasons. Might be a tacky way to say it, but you have a very cool, collected view on it, and it's definitely one that I share. So again, really happy. If there's anything I could ever do to help support you guys, let me know. And until next time, thanks for stopping by.
I appreciate it, Michael. Thank you, sir.
Yep. Thank you.